In 1883, the island of Krakatoa was erased from the map. There is no official explanation for why a volcano grew back in that exact spot. The new cone, called Anak Krakatau, first broke the surface of the Sunda Strait in 1927. It has erupted more than 40 times since then, and by most counts, it is still growing today. Over the next few minutes, we'll trace what's documented about the original catastrophe, what's known about the volcano that replaced it, and the moment, less than a decade ago, when that same crater produced a tsunami with almost no warning at all. Here's what we actually know about the eruption itself. Krakatoa sat in the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra, and by the summer of 1883, it had been rumbling for months. The catastrophic sequence struck on the morning of August 27th, and the largest explosion, recorded at roughly 10 past 10 local time, is often cited as the loudest sound in recorded history. British colonial officers on Rodrigues Island in the middle of the Indian Ocean logged hearing what they described as distant cannon fire, a sound that had traveled an estimated 4,800 kilometers, close to 3,000 miles from its source. That's not folklore passed down through generations. It's a written entry in a ship's log, cross-referenced against the documented timing of the blast. But that's not the strangest part. The explosion didn't just make noise, it moved the atmosphere itself. Barometers in cities as far away as London and Washington, D.C. recorded a spike in air pressure as the shockwave passed overhead. And by most accounts, that same pressure wave circled the planet at least 4 times before instruments stopped registering it clearly. Sailors aboard ships within roughly 65 kilometers of Krakatoa reportedly had their eardrums ruptured by the blast itself. Some volcanologists argue that treating 1883 as a freak, one-off event undersells how routinely this kind of caldera collapse eruption may recur on geologic timescales. And that's genuinely worth arguing about in the comments, because the data on recurrence intervals is thinner than most people assume. Try to imagine standing on a ship's deck that morning, feeling a sound before your mind can even register it as sound. That's still the easy part of this story compared to what's coming. Volcanologists classify the 1883 eruption at the top end of the Volcanic Explosivity Index, a scale most researchers use to rank eruptions by how much material they ejected and how violently they did it. By that measure, Krakatoa sits among a small handful of eruptions in recorded history judged powerful enough to physically remove most of an island in a matter of hours. The eruption column itself is estimated to have punched debris more than 25 kilometers into the atmosphere, well past the layer where commercial weather systems form. Here's where the official version starts to crack, though. Precise energy figures for the blast vary enormously between studies, some citing yields many times larger than others, because no instrument in 1883 was actually built to measure an explosion of that scale. And every modern estimate is a reconstruction after the fact. Officially, the destructive force of Krakatoa is explained by the eruption columns and pressure waves alone. The problem is that most of the death toll didn't come from the explosions at all. Researchers have estimated that at least 36,000 people died as a direct result of the eruption, and the overwhelming majority of those deaths, somewhere above 34,000 by most counts, came from a series of tsunamis that followed the final blasts, some with run-up heights reported at over 30 meters in low-lying coastal areas of Java and Sumatra. Entire coastal settlements were documented as gone by the time relief ships arrived. Here's a detail that doesn't get discussed enough. The official records from 1883 were compiled by a colonial administration with incomplete reach into smaller fishing villages, which means the true number may never be fully settled. If the real toll runs higher than what's written down, what do you think happened to the communities that were never counted? That's a theory worth leaving in the comments. That's where the documented trail on the human toll stops. But the eruption's reach didn't stop at the coastline. The ash and sulfur dioxide Krakatoa injected into the stratosphere spread around the globe within weeks. And by the following year, researchers have found that global average temperatures had measurably dropped, with the effect averaging out to more than a full degree Celsius when tracked across the several years that followed. Sunsets turned vivid shades of red and orange across Europe and North America for months, prompting panicked newspaper reports of fires on the horizon that turned out to be nothing more than volcanic haze scattering sunlight. There's one detail researchers keep coming back to. Some art historians have proposed that the blood-red sky in Edvard Munch's painting *The Scream*, made about a decade later, may echo skies he witnessed during this exact period. Though this remains a contested hypothesis, not a settled fact, and plenty of scholars push back on it. Officially, the case is closed. Sulfate aerosols cooled the planet, full stop. The detail nobody fully resolves is how far that atmospheric disturbance reached into culture and memory, not just climate data. Go back to that number from the opening, 4,800 kilometers. Because the same physical process that carried that sound is the one that shaped the temperature record you just heard about. Both are consequences of an eruption violent enough to punch material and pressure straight through multiple layers of the atmosphere at once. If topics like documented, verifiable anomalies tied to a single place on Earth are the kind of thing that keeps you watching, this channel builds an entire catalog of them, so it's worth sticking around and subscribing for what comes next. Because everything up to this point is really just the setup for what Krakatoa left behind. What was left, physically, was mostly ocean. The final explosions collapsed roughly 2/3 of the original island into the sea, leaving behind a submerged caldera and a scattering of fragments where a landmass used to be. For over 4 decades, the site was quiet enough that maps simply marked open water where a mountain had once stood. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. In December of 1927, fishermen and surveyors began reporting steam and debris rising from the same submerged caldera. A small island briefly broke the surface, was destroyed by wave action within about a week, and reformed again. A cycle that repeated until a stable cone finally held above sea level by around 1930. Indonesian residents named it Anak Krakatau, which translates to Child of Krakatoa, and the name stuck in both local use and the scientific literature. Unlike its parents' single catastrophic destruction, this volcano grew the slow way, through repeated small eruptions that layered lava and ash on top of each other year after year. If you'd watched that first patch of steam break the surface in 1927, would you have guessed it was the beginning of a volcano, or just assumed it was a passing anomaly? By most current counts, Anak Krakatau has produced more than 40 documented eruptions since it first emerged, making it one of the most consistently active volcanoes in Indonesia. That's now the 3rd documented phase of activity tied to this single stretch of the Sunda Strait, and not the last one on this list. Compared to what's still ahead in this story, even that level of activity is still the easy part. Indonesia's Volcanological Survey, the government agency responsible for monitoring volcanoes across the archipelago, has maintained observation posts watching Anak Krakatau for decades, tracking seismic activity, gas emissions, and visible changes to the cone from both the ground and from satellite imagery. That kind of sustained monitoring is exactly why the volcano's ordinary eruptions rarely catch anyone off guard. Ash plumes and minor explosive activity get flagged and communicated well in advance, most of the time. Picture that infrastructure for a moment. Instruments running continuously, records kept for generations, an entire agency built around not being surprised by this specific volcano. Now hold that picture, because it's about to matter. Officially, a volcano this closely watched, sitting in one of the most heavily monitored straits in Indonesia, should never produce a disaster without warning. The problem is the one detail nobody accounted for. On December 22, 2018, a section of Anak Krakatau's southwestern flank, researchers have estimated a volume of roughly 0.2 cubic kilometers of rock and debris, slid into the sea during an ongoing eruption. Because the collapse was driven by gravity and volcanic instability, rather than by a large earthquake, it didn't generate the kind of strong seismic signal that regional monitoring networks were built to detect. There was no earthquake to trigger a tsunami alert, because there was no significant earthquake at all. What the data doesn't explain away is what happened next. Within about 30 minutes, a tsunami generated by that landslide struck the coastlines of western Java and southern Sumatra, with run-up heights reported as high as 13.5 meters in some locations. Researchers have put the death toll at 437 people, with roughly 13,000 more injured and tens of thousands displaced from coastal communities that had no seismic signal, no siren, and no advance notice that anything unusual was happening beneath the water. This is the detail that makes Krakatau's story genuinely unresolved rather than simply tragic. A volcano capable of catastrophic flank failure sits inside a monitoring system that was built to catch a different kind of danger entirely. No one disputes that the seismic network functioned exactly as designed. It's the second part, that the actual threat came from a hazard the network wasn't built to catch, that causes the argument among researchers today. In the aftermath, surveys found that Anak Krakatau had lost a substantial portion of its height and overall volume in the span of minutes, essentially resetting decades of gradual growth in a single event. And yet, within months, the volcano was already showing renewed activity, rebuilding the same way it always has, one small eruption at a time. Researchers are genuinely split on how predictable the next flank failure would actually be, given that the trigger mechanism that mattered most in 2018 wasn't the one existing monitoring was designed around. Where do you land on that? Is a volcano like this fundamentally unpredictable? Or is it a monitoring gap that better instruments could eventually close? That's a question this channel would genuinely like to hear your theory on, in the comments below. No one can tell you with certainty whether the child volcano now quietly rebuilding itself in the Sunda Strait is simply repeating its normal growth cycle, or slowly working toward another version of the event that destroyed its parent in 1883. That question sits at the center of ongoing volcanological research into Krakatau, and it does not have a documented answer yet. Come back to that first fact one more time. An island erased in 1883, heard from 3,000 miles away, cooling the planet within a year. What's proven is extensive. The eruption's acoustic reach, its tsunamis, its measurable effect on global temperature, and the mechanics of Anak Krakatau's slow return from the same caldera are all documented in instrument records, ship's logs, and peer-reviewed surveys. What remains genuinely open is smaller in scope, but heavier in consequence. Whether the exact hazard that killed 400 in colony in 2018, with almost no warning, will recur in a form current monitoring can actually catch in time. This isn't really a story about a volcano that came back. It's a story about how a place can rebuild itself using the same mechanism that once destroyed it, and about the gap that can still exist between watching something closely and truly understanding what it's about to do. Somewhere beneath the surface of the Sunda Strait right now, that same volcano is still growing, and no one can tell you exactly what it's building toward.